The candle on the table had burned down to a stub, and Alara Voss stood frozen behind the tall curtain, one hand pressed flat against her own chest, as if she could hold her heart still by force. On the other side of the thin velvet, in the private council room of the Northern Palace, King Aldrich Thorne was speaking in the low, careless voice men use when they believe no one important is listening. "She is not what the crown needs standing beside it," Aldrich said. "Alara is dutiful. Alara is quiet. But quiet does not win the love of a kingdom. Seraphine does." Alara's fingers curled into the fabric of the curtain. She had come to this wing of the palace to return a signed betrothal scroll, the same scroll that had defined the last 3 years of her life, the same scroll that promised she would become queen before the end of the year. She had not meant to overhear anything. She had simply arrived a few minutes early, and the guards outside had waved her through, without warning her that the king was already inside with his advisors, already deciding her fate without her in the room. "The northern houses respect the Voss name," said an older voice, one of Aldrich's senior advisors, a thin man named Garrick, who had never once looked Alara in the eye during a public function. Breaking the betrothal, with the elder daughter, could cause difficulty. There were promises made. "Promises can be rewritten," Aldrich answered. "I will still marry a Voss, only a different one. Seraphine is younger, warmer, easier for the people to love. She smiles in a way that makes men forget why they were angry. Alara has never once made anyone forget anything." A short, ugly laugh followed his words. Alara did not recognize whose laugh it was, and in that moment, it did not matter. What mattered was the sentence that came next, delivered so plainly, so without cruelty, that it cut deeper than an insult would have. "I will announce the change quietly, after the summer gathering. No scandal. No blame placed on anyone. Alara will simply step aside, and Seraphine will step forward, and by winter, there will be a new queen, and no one will remember there was ever a different arrangement." Alara did not move. She did not gasp, did not let a single sound escape her throat, though her whole body wanted to shake. 3 years. 3 years of council meetings she had sat through out of duty. 3 years of learning the histories of noble houses so she would not embarrass the crown. 3 years of believing that being chosen meant something, that it meant she mattered to the man who would one day rule beside her. And all of it had been a placeholder, a convenience, waiting to be swapped out the moment something better arrived. She thought of her sister's face at breakfast that morning, bright and easy, completely unaware, or perhaps not unaware at all, and the thought made Alara's stomach turn cold. She stepped back from the curtain slowly, careful not to let her shoes click against the marble floor, and she walked away from that hallway with her spine straight and her expression calm, the way she had been trained to walk since she was a child of noble blood, who was taught that feelings were something to be managed, not displayed. She did not return to her chambers immediately. She walked instead through the eastern garden, past the stone fountain where she used to sit with her mother before her mother passed, and she let the cold evening air settle into her lungs until the shaking in her hands finally stopped. By the time she reached her room, she had already made a decision, though she would not have called it a decision yet. It felt more like a door opening in a wall she had believed was solid her entire life. She did not cry that night. She sat at her writing desk with a single candle burning and stared at the betrothal scroll she had been about to return, the one with her own signature at the bottom, in careful, practiced handwriting, and she thought about every version of herself that scroll represented. The girl who had agreed to the match because her father told her it was an honor. The young woman who had spent years learning the correct way to greet foreign dignitaries because she believed she would need that skill as queen. The person who had quietly given up so many small parts of herself, her opinions, her preferences, her plans, because she had been told that a future queen does not have room for such things. All of it, gone in a single overheard sentence. There was a soft knock at her door near midnight, and when she opened it, her sister stood there in a pale blue dressing gown, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, looking every bit as lovely and untroubled as the king had described her. "I heard you walking in the garden," Seraphine said, tilting her head. "Are you well? You look pale." Alara studied her sister's face for a long moment, searching for some sign of guilt, some flicker of knowledge, and found nothing but genuine concern, which somehow made everything worse. If Seraphine did not know, then she had not schemed for this. She had simply existed, warm and easy and likable, and that had been enough to replace her older sister, without either of them doing anything at all. "I am tired," Elara said, and it was not a lie. "It has been a long day." Seraphine reached out and squeezed her hand, the way she had done since they were children, and said something gentle about how excited she was for the summer gathering, how the whole kingdom would be watching the two sisters of House Voss stand beside the throne. Elara smiled and nodded, and said all the correct things, and the entire time a single thought repeated itself in her mind, like a drumbeat she could not silence. "I will not be standing beside that throne." Not because I was pushed aside gently and quietly, as if I were furniture being rearranged. I will not give him the satisfaction of a smooth transition. When Seraphine finally left, Elara sat back down at her desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment. She began to write, not a farewell letter, not an accusation, but a simple request to her father for permission to visit their family's northern estate for a season, citing her health and her need for rest before the gathering season began in earnest. It was, technically, not a lie. She did intend to travel north. She simply did not intend to stop at the family estate. She had heard the servants whisper about the northern border for years, about the vast wooded territory beyond the last checkpoint, where Valoran's authority quietly stopped mattering, where a different kind of ruler held power that even kings hesitated to challenge. The Emberfang Pack, the Lycans, a name that made court officials lower their voices and change the subject, a name that King Aldric's own father had once tried and failed to bring under crown control, a name that even now made Aldric's advisors nervous whenever northern trade routes were discussed. She did not know exactly why that territory came to mind first, except that it was the one place in the entire kingdom where the king's reach meant nothing at all. If she was going to disappear from the life that had been quietly planned around her, she wanted to disappear somewhere he could not simply send a polite envoy to retrieve her. The following morning, Elara moved through the palace with the same practiced calm she always carried, greeting servants, attending a brief meeting about upcoming trade shipments, sitting through a fitting for a summer gown she now knew she would likely never wear to any royal event. She watched Aldric across the breakfast table, watched the easy, unbothered way he discussed the weather and the harvest reports, and she found herself studying his face, as if she had never truly seen it before. He was handsome, in the practiced way that portraits made kings look handsome. He was polite to her, in the practiced way that men are polite to something they intend to discard without conflict, and she understood, with a clarity that almost felt like relief, that she had spent 3 years mistaking his politeness for affection. By midday, her father had granted permission for her northern trip without hesitation, distracted as he was by preparations for the gathering, and Elara began quietly making arrangements. She packed lightly, choosing practical traveling clothes rather than anything ornamental, and she told only her most trusted maid, a steady young woman named Nora who had served her since childhood, that she intended to leave within 2 days. Nora did not ask many questions, though her eyes were sharp with concern, when Elara explained she would be traveling with a smaller escort than usual, and further north than the family estate. "You are certain, my lady?" Nora asked, folding a traveling cloak with careful hands. "I have never been more certain of anything," Elara said, and she was surprised to find it was true. That evening, she passed Seraphine in the corridor outside the music room, and her sister caught her arm gently, smiling. "You seem different today," Seraphine said. "Lighter somehow. I am glad. I was worried about you last night." Elara looked at her sister's open, trusting face, and felt a complicated wave of tenderness and grief pass through her. Whatever was coming, whatever choice King Aldric had already made, it was not Seraphine's fault, and Elara found she could not hold on to any real anger toward her. The anger belonged entirely to the man who had decided, in a private room with his advisors, that one sister could simply be traded for another, without a single word spoken to the person being replaced. "I am simply thinking about my trip north," Elara said. "I think the rest will do me good." "You will write to me?" Seraphine asked. "Of course," Elara said, and this time the lie came more easily, because she genuinely intended to write, eventually, once she understood what her life was going to become. That night, sleep did not come easily. Elara lay in the dark of her chamber, listening to the distant sound of palace guards changing posts, and she allowed herself, for the first time since overhearing that conversation, to actually feel the weight of what had happened. Not the practical weight of packing and travel arrangements, but the deeper ache of being unwanted by someone she had spent years trying to be worthy of. She thought of every dinner she had sat through correcting her posture, every conversation she had rehearsed in her mind beforehand to avoid saying the wrong thing, every ambition she had quietly folded away because a future queen was not supposed to want things for herself. And beneath the ache, something else began to grow, not despair, but a kind of fierce clarity she had never allowed herself to feel before. If she was not going to be queen, if she was not going to be chosen, then she was finally, for the first time in her adult life, free to choose something for herself. She thought again of the northern border, of the packed territory no one in the palace dared discuss with confidence, of the name that made even the king's advisors uneasy, Alpha Cade Ashgrove. She had heard it only a handful of times over the years, always spoken with a mixture of caution and grudging respect, always followed by some comment about how the crown had never managed to bring the Emberfang pack fully under its authority, not through treaties, not through pressure, not through anything at all. She did not know what she would find there. She did not know if the pack would even allow her past their borders, given that she was the very kind of noble outsider they likely had every reason to distrust. But something about the idea steadied her in a way nothing else had since the previous evening. If she was going to walk away from the life that had been arranged around her, she did not want to walk into another arrangement. She wanted to walk into the one place where no one had decided her worth in advance. 2 mornings later, before the sun had fully risen over the palace towers, Ilara stood in the stable yard dressed in simple traveling clothes, a modest satchel slung over her shoulder, watching the stable hands prepare her horse. Nora stood nearby, having insisted on helping with the final preparations, despite Ilara's protests that she did not need to trouble herself so early. "Take care of yourself, my lady," Nora said quietly, tucking a small bundle of provisions into the saddlebag. "Whatever it is you are truly riding toward." Ilara looked at her for a long moment, grateful that Nora had never once demanded the full truth, only offered quiet loyalty, in whatever form Ilara needed it. "I will," she said. "And Nora, if anyone asks where I have gone, you know only that I rode north to rest. That is all you know." Nora nodded once, understanding passing silently between them. As Ilara mounted her horse and the small escort of 2 guards took their positions, she allowed herself one final look back at the palace, its pale stone towers catching the first gold light of morning, familiar and enormous and suddenly foreign to her. Somewhere inside those walls, King Aldrich was likely still asleep, unaware that the woman he intended to quietly discard had already decided to remove herself entirely from his plans, before he ever had the chance to announce them. She turned her horse toward the northern road and did not look back again. The first stretch of the journey passed the way such journeys always did, through familiar countryside dotted with farms and small villages that had long paid tribute to the crown, past checkpoints where guards recognized the Voss family crest and waved her through with polite bows. Ilara answered questions about her destination with the same practiced calm she had used her entire life, mentioning the family estate, mentioning rest, never once mentioning the true edge of the map she intended to reach. It was on the 3rd day, when the villages grew sparser and the road narrower, winding up into hill country thick with pine forest, that her 2 guards began to grow visibly uneasy. They knew, as most of the kingdom's soldiers knew, that beyond a certain point, the roads belonged less to the crown and more to whoever controlled the wilderness surrounding them. "My lady," said the elder of the 2 guards, a steady man named Edmund who had served her family for over a decade, "the family estate lies to the east from this fork. We should turn now, if we intend to reach it before nightfall." Ilara reined her horse to a stop at the fork in the road, studying the path that continued north, narrower and rougher, disappearing into darker trees. She had known this moment would come, had rehearsed what she would say, but standing at the actual crossroads made the words feel heavier in her mouth than they had in her imagination. "I am not going to the estate," she said. "I am continuing north." Edmund's expression shifted from confusion to open alarm. "My lady, north of here is Emberfang territory. It is not safe for a party such as ours. The crown has no authority there, and the pack does not welcome outsiders." "I know," Ilara said, and something in her voice, some quiet steel that had not been there before this journey began, made both guards fall silent. You do not have to accompany me further. I will not order you into danger you did not choose, but I am continuing north, with or without you." The two men exchanged a long look, and Alara watched them weigh loyalty against fear, duty against the plain instruction she had just given them. Finally, Edmund spoke again, more gently this time. "We swore to protect you, my lady. We will not abandon that oath simply because the road grows dangerous." Alara felt a rush of gratitude so sharp it nearly brought tears to her eyes, the first real emotion she had allowed herself to show since leaving the palace. "Thank you," she said simply, and then she turned her horse north, toward the darker trees, toward a territory that made even seasoned soldiers uneasy, toward a future she could not yet see the shape of, but had chosen, entirely and completely, for herself. The forest thickened as the day wore on, the sunlight growing dim and green through the dense canopy overhead, the road narrowing until it was barely wide enough for two horses to walk side by side. The air itself seemed to change, cooler and heavier, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and something else Alara could not quite name, something wild, that made the hair on her arms rise even though nothing threatening had yet appeared. They rode in silence for hours, the only sounds the soft thud of hooves on packed earth, and the distant call of birds somewhere in the high branches. Alara found her mind drifting back, unwillingly, to the conversation she had overheard, to Aldrich's careless voice, describing her as something without warmth, without the ability to make anyone forget their anger. She wondered, not for the first time, whether he was right, whether she truly was as unremarkable as he believed. But then she looked at the darkening forest around her, at the path she had chosen entirely on her own, at the guards who had chosen loyalty over safety beside her, and she thought that perhaps Aldrich had simply never bothered to look closely enough to see her at all. As evening approached, the shadows between the trees grew long and strange, and Edmund called for them to make camp before the light failed entirely. They found a small clearing near a stream, and as the younger guard, a quiet man named Garrett, began gathering wood for a fire, Alara sat on a fallen log, and finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion of the past several days settle fully into her bones. It was as the fire caught and the first true darkness of the forest closed in around their small camp that Alara heard it, a sound unlike anything she had heard before, distant but unmistakably deliberate, a long, low howl rising somewhere beyond the trees, followed a moment later by another, closer, as if in answer. Edmund's hand went immediately to the hilt of his sword, and Garrett rose from the fire, his eyes scanning the dark tree line with open fear. Alara stood as well, her heart hammering, but beneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting for exactly this sound, since the moment she decided to ride north. "My lady," Edmund said quietly, positioning himself between Alara and the sound, "get behind me." But Alara did not move. She stood very still at the edge of the firelight, staring into the darkness beyond the trees, and she waited to see what would step out of it. The shapes that emerged from the trees were not wolves, not entirely, and not men either, though they walked upright with a controlled, deliberate grace that made them somehow more unsettling than either form alone would have been. There were 4 of them, tall and broad-shouldered, their eyes catching the firelight with a faint golden shine, their movements silent despite their size. Garrett let out a sharp breath and stepped backward, nearly stumbling into the fire, while Edmund kept his sword raised, his arm steady even though Alara could see the tension in his shoulders. "We are not here to fight," Alara said, before either of her guards could speak, her voice carrying further than she expected in the quiet forest. "I have come seeking an audience with Alpha Cade Ashgrove." One of the 4 figures, a woman with sharp cheekbones and dark hair, pulled back tightly from her face, stepped forward from the others, studying Alara, with an expression that was not hostile, but was not welcoming either. It was simply assessing, the way a merchant might study an unfamiliar coin, to determine whether it was genuine or counterfeit. "You are a long way from the crown's roads," the woman said. "Nobles from the palace do not simply ride into Emberfang territory asking for audiences. State your name and your purpose, and state them honestly, because we will know if you lie." "My name is Alara Voss," Alara said, holding the woman's gaze without flinching, though her pulse was still racing. "I am not here on behalf of the crown. I am not here to negotiate treaties or deliver messages. I have left the palace, and I am not returning. I came here because this is the one place in the kingdom the crown cannot follow me easily, and because I have nowhere else to go that I trust." For a long moment, none of the four figures spoke, and Alara became acutely aware of the fire crackling behind her, of Edmund's sword still raised at her side, of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Then the woman's expression shifted slightly, something like curiosity replacing the earlier suspicion. "Voss," she repeated. "The king's betrothed." "Not anymore," Alara said, and something in the flat certainty of her own voice surprised even her. "Not by my choice, but not anymore regardless." The woman exchanged a glance with the three others beside her, a silent conversation passing between them that Alara could not follow, before she finally spoke again. "You will come with us. Your guards may accompany you as far as the outer settlement, but they will not be permitted deeper into Packlands without express permission. The Alpha will decide what happens from there." Edmund began to object, his loyalty clearly warring with the plain danger of the situation, but Alara placed a steadying hand on his arm. "It is all right," she said quietly. "We came this far. There is no turning back now. That would be safer than going forward." The journey deeper into the forest that followed was unlike anything Alara had experienced in her sheltered life at court. The four pack members moved with an ease through the dense undergrowth that made her own horse's careful, stumbling progress feel clumsy by comparison, and though they said little, she found herself studying them as closely as they studied her, trying to understand what kind of world she was walking into. The trees eventually thinned into a wide, torch-lit clearing surrounded by sturdy wooden structures, far more organized and permanent than Alara had expected from whispered court rumors that painted the Emberfang pack as little more than wild creatures living in the wilderness. There were homes, workshops, a central hall larger than the rest, and dozens of pack members going about evening tasks who all paused, one by one, to watch the small procession pass through with open curiosity. Alara was brought to the central hall, its wooden doors thick and carved with intricate patterns of running wolves, and it was there, standing in the doorway with firelight behind him, that she saw Alpha Cade Ashgrove for the first time. He was tall, taller than Aldrich, with dark hair, and a stillness to him that immediately reminded Alara of a held breath, as if every movement he made was deliberate, nothing wasted. His eyes, when they settled on her, held the same faint golden shine she had noticed in his scouts, though in him, it seemed sharper, more present. He wore simple, dark clothing, without ornamentation, nothing like the ceremonial finery of the palace, and yet he carried himself with an authority that made Alara instinctively straighten her own posture. "A Voss," Cade said, his voice low and even, giving nothing away. "In my territory." "Uninvited." "I am aware of how it looks," Alara said, refusing to let her voice waver, despite the way his gaze seemed to weigh every word she spoke. "I am not here as a representative of the crown, and I am not here to ask for anything you are not willing to give freely. I am here because I have left the palace, and I needed somewhere the king's reach does not easily extend." Something flickered across Cade's expression, gone too quickly for Alara to name it. "The king's betrothed," he said, echoing the scout's earlier words. "Fleeing her own wedding." "There will be no wedding," Alara said. "The king intends to set me aside from my sister. I overheard him say so himself, to his advisors, as though I were an inconvenient piece of furniture being rearranged. I did not come here to hide from that decision. I came here because I refused to let him control how I leave." The hall had grown quiet around them, pack members near the entrance clearly listening, though none of them spoke. Cade studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes unreadable, and Alara forced herself to hold still under that scrutiny, refusing to look away first. "You understand," Cade said finally, "that sheltering you would not be a small thing. Your king has spent years searching for reasons to bring this territory under his authority. Harboring his cast-off bride would hand him exactly the provocation he has been waiting for." "I understand," Alara said. "I am not asking you to shelter me out of kindness. I have nothing to offer you in return, except the truth. And the truth is that I would rather face whatever danger exists here than return to a life where my worth is decided in private rooms, without my knowledge." Cade's gaze did not soften exactly, but something in it shifted, a recalculation happening behind his eyes that Alara could not fully read. He turned to the woman who had first found them in the forest. "Miriam," See that her guards are given shelter for the night in the outer settlement. They may decide in the morning whether they wish to remain or return to the palace." Miriam nodded and stepped away to relay instructions, leaving Alara standing alone before the Alpha, the weight of his attention settling over her like something almost physical. "And me?" Alara asked, refusing to let the tremor she felt inside reach her voice. "You," Cade said slowly, "will stay in the central hall tonight. Tomorrow, we will discuss exactly what your presence here means, for both of us." He turned and walked deeper into the hall, without waiting to see if she followed, and Alara stood for a moment in the doorway, watching his retreating back, feeling the full weight of the choice she had made settle over her. She had left behind everything familiar, everything certain, for a man she had never met, and a territory that answered to no crown. And yet, as she finally stepped forward to follow him into the firelit hall, she felt something she had not expected to feel at all in this moment. She felt, for the first time in years, that she was standing somewhere entirely on her own terms. The central hall, once she stepped fully inside, was warmer and less austere than its heavy wooden doors had suggested. A great hearth burned along one wall, and long tables lined with simple benches filled most of the open floor, though at this hour, only a handful of pack members remained, speaking quietly over cups of something that smelled faintly of herbs and smoke. They watched Alara pass with open curiosity, but no open hostility, which she found, oddly, more disarming than outright suspicion would have been. Cade led her to a smaller chamber off the main hall, sparsely furnished but clean, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out onto the dark tree line beyond the settlement. "You will stay here tonight," he said, standing in the doorway rather than entering fully. "There is a guard posted outside, not to keep you contained, but to ensure no one disturbs you, who has not yet grown accustomed to strangers within our borders." "Thank you," Alara said, and she meant it, though the word felt strange in her mouth after the tension of the day. Cade studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You should know that I have not decided to help you, Alara Voss. I have decided only to hear you further before I decide anything at all. Do not mistake tonight's shelter for tomorrow's answer." "I understand," Alara said. "I did not expect kindness. I only hoped for a chance to explain myself honestly." Something in his expression shifted again, that same unreadable flicker from the hall, before he inclined his head slightly and stepped back from the doorway. "Rest, if you can. Tomorrow will require clearer thinking than tonight allows." He left her then, and Alara sat on the narrow bed in the quiet chamber, listening to the distant sounds of the settlement settling into night, the crackle of far-off fires, low voices carried on the wind, and somewhere beyond it all, the vast dark forest, stretching endlessly toward a horizon she could no longer see. She thought of the palace, of her sister's trusting smile, of Aldrich's careless voice describing her as forgettable, and she found that the ache of those memories had already begun to feel like it belonged to a different life entirely. Whatever came next, whatever Cade Ashgrove decided in the morning, Alara understood with growing certainty that she would not regret the choice that had brought her here. For the first time since she could remember, her future was not something being decided for her in another room, by another voice, without her knowledge or consent. It was, finally, something she had chosen herself, and that alone was worth whatever danger still lay ahead. Morning came to the settlement long before Alara expected it, the pale light finding its way through her narrow window, while the forest outside was still wrapped in mist. She had slept in fragments, waking often to unfamiliar sounds, the distant howl of some creature far off in the trees, the soft murmur of voices passing outside her door, and each time she woke, it took her a moment to remember exactly where she was and why. A young pack member, a girl no older than 15 with quick eyes and an easy smile, brought a simple breakfast of bread and dried fruit to her door shortly after sunrise, along with a change of clothing more suited to the rugged terrain than the fine traveling dress Alara had arrived in. "Alpha Cade wants to see you after you eat," the girl said. "In the council chamber, past the main hall. I can show you the way if you like." Alara thanked her, and ate quickly, her stomach too tight with nerves to fully enjoy the food, before changing into the plain wool dress the girl had brought. It fit reasonably well, simple and practical, nothing like the elaborate gowns she had worn her entire adult life, and there was something strangely freeing about the change, as if shedding the fine fabric of the palace, was one more small step away from the life she had left behind. The council chamber, when she was led into it, was smaller than the main hall but no less imposing, dominated by a long wooden table and walls lined with maps of the surrounding territory, hand-drawn and marked with symbols Ilara did not fully understand. Cade stood near one of the maps when she entered, along with Miriam and two other pack members Ilara had not yet met, an older man with a gray-streaked beard, and a younger man closer to Cade's own age who watched Ilara with open wariness. "Sit," Cade said, gesturing to a chair at the table, and Ilara did, folding her hands carefully in her lap in a posture that had been drilled into her since childhood, though she was acutely aware that none of the manners she had learned at court would matter much in this room. "I have spent the night considering your situation," Cade began, his voice measured and even, "and I want to be honest with you about what I see. Your presence here is not simple. It is not a matter of offering shelter to a wayward noblewoman and expecting nothing in return, because your king will not see it that way. He will see it as an insult, a challenge to his authority, and he will respond accordingly." "I understand that," Ilara said. "I told you as much last night. I am not asking you to pretend the danger does not exist." "Good," Cade said. "Because I intend to offer you protection, but I will not pretend it is a selfless act. This pack has spent generations resisting the Crown's attempts to bring us under its authority, through treaties we refuse to sign, through pressure we refuse to bow to. Your presence here, whether either of us intended it or not, is an opportunity. Sheltering the king's cast-off bride sends a message to Valoran that this territory answers to no one but itself." The older man with the gray beard spoke up then, his voice rough but not unkind. "You would be using her as a piece in a larger conflict, Alpha, and she should hear that plainly stated before she agrees to anything." "I am already saying it plainly, Gareth," Cade said, without looking away from Ilara. "I will not lie to you about my reasons, Ilara Voss. If I offer you protection, it is not purely out of concern for your well-being, though I do not wish you harm. It is because your presence here benefits this pack politically, and I believe in being honest about that from the start, rather than dressing it up as something nobler than it is." Ilara felt something steady settle inside her chest at his bluntness, an odd kind of relief after years of court diplomacy, where every kindness came wrapped in hidden motives no one ever admitted aloud. "I appreciate the honesty," she said, "more than you know. I have spent years surrounded by people who smiled at me while deciding my future without my knowledge. I would rather understand exactly what I am agreeing to than be protected by pretty words that hide the truth." Something like respect flickered across Cade's face, quickly hidden but not entirely gone. "Then we understand each other," he said. "I offer you shelter within these borders, protection from the Crown's attempts to reclaim you, and in exchange, your presence here stands as a statement, whether spoken aloud or not, that this pack does not answer to Valoran's throne." "And if I agree," Ilara said carefully, "what is expected of me, beyond simply existing here as a symbol?" "You will live among us," Cade said. "You will follow the customs of this territory, learn its ways, contribute where you are able. You will not be a prisoner, and you will not be paraded as a trophy either, but you should understand that leaving these borders again, at least in the near future, would be dangerous, both for you and for the position this pack has taken in sheltering you." Ilara considered his words carefully, aware of the weight of the decision, aware that agreeing meant tying herself entirely to a conflict she had only stumbled into by accident, a conflict between Crown and pack that had existed long before she arrived and would likely continue long after. But she thought again of the alternative, of returning to the palace, of being quietly set aside for her sister, while the entire court pretended not to notice, and she found the choice, in the end, was not difficult at all. "I agree," she said. Cade studied her for a long moment, as if searching for hesitation or doubt, and finding none, he nodded once, a small gesture that seemed to settle something between them. "Then it is decided. You will remain here under this pack's protection." The younger man who had watched Ilara warily since she entered the chamber finally spoke, his tone sharp with skepticism. "Alpha, with respect, how can we be certain she is not a spy sent to gather information for the Crown, using this story of a broken betrothal as cover?" "I considered that possibility as well, Felix," Cade said calmly. which is why I have already sent word to trusted contacts near the palace to quietly confirm her account. If her story proves false, we will know soon enough, and I will act accordingly. But I do not believe deception explains what I witnessed last night. A skilled spy does not ride into hostile territory with only 2 guards and no plan beyond honesty. Felix did not look entirely convinced, but he said nothing further, deferring to his alpha's judgment, even if his own doubts remained visible on his face. Alara noted the exchange carefully, understanding that not everyone within these borders would welcome her presence as readily as Cade himself seemed willing to, and that trust here, as anywhere, would have to be earned rather than simply granted. The meeting continued for some time longer, discussing practical matters, where Alara would be housed, what role she might occupy within the settlement's daily rhythms, how word of her presence should be managed to avoid unnecessary alarm among the pack's wider population. Throughout it all, Alara found herself watching Cade more closely than she probably should have, noting the careful, deliberate way he weighed every decision, the way his voice never rose even when Felix's skepticism edged toward open challenge, the quiet authority that seemed to require no raised voice or grand gesture to command the room's full attention. It was so different from Aldrich's style of leadership, all polished words and careful public performances, designed to be admired rather than truly understood. Cade seemed almost indifferent to how he was perceived, focused entirely on the practical reality of the decisions before him, and Alara found herself, despite the strangeness and danger of her new circumstances, oddly steadied by his presence. When the meeting finally concluded and the others filed out of the chamber, Cade remained behind, and for a moment, the 2 of them stood alone amid the maps and the quiet morning light filtering through the chamber's single high window. "You surprised me last night," Cade said, breaking the silence. "Most nobles who wander into this territory do so out of desperation or foolishness, expecting either violence or easy sympathy. You offered neither excuse. You simply told the truth and let it stand on its own." "It was all I had to offer," Alara said simply. "I did not come here with a plan beyond survival. Everything since has been decided moment by moment." "That is not a weakness," Cade said, and something in his tone made Alara look up at him more directly than she had allowed herself to before. "Most people who arrive here with careful plans crumble the moment those plans fail to unfold as expected. You arrived with nothing but honesty, and it has served you better than any plan could have." Alara did not know how to respond to that, some quiet warmth spreading through her chest that she did not fully understand and was not entirely certain she trusted yet. "Thank you," she said finally, "for hearing me last night, and for being honest with me this morning. I know you did not have to be. I find honesty tends to serve better than diplomacy in the long run," Cade said, something almost like the ghost of a smile touching his mouth before it disappeared again. "You will find that is generally true of this territory. We do not deal in the same careful lies your palace prefers." He turned then, gesturing for her to follow, and led her out of the council chamber into the bright morning air of the settlement, where the day's activities were already well underway, pack members moving between workshops and training grounds with a purposeful energy Alara had rarely witnessed within the more formal, ceremonial rhythms of palace life. As she followed Cade through the settlement, receiving curious glances from those they passed, Alara felt the last threads of her old life finally begin to loosen their hold on her entirely. Whatever came next, whatever dangers still waited beyond these borders, she had chosen this path with open eyes, and she intended to walk it fully, without looking back, toward a throne that had never truly valued her at all. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Alara had never experienced in her life at court, one built around practical work rather than ceremony, around plain speech rather than careful diplomacy. She woke early, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, and found that the settlement expected everyone within it, regardless of rank, to contribute something useful to the daily running of pack life. Her first attempts were clumsy. She had spent years learning which fork to use for which course, which curtsy suited which visiting dignitary, but she had never learned to gather herbs correctly, or mend a torn net, or even build a proper fire without burning her fingers in the process. Miriam, who seemed to have appointed herself as Alara's unofficial guide through these early days, watched her fumble through her first attempt at splitting firewood, with an expression that was not unkind, but was not particularly patient either. "You are gripping the axe wrong," Miriam said, stepping forward to adjust Alara's hands on the handle. Let the weight of the blade do the work. You are trying to force it, and that is why your arms are already shaking. Forgive me, Alara said, embarrassed. I was never taught tasks like this. No, Miriam agreed, not unkindly. You were taught to be looked at, not to be useful. It is not your fault. But it is not useful here either, so you will learn. Alara found, to her own surprise, that she did not resent the correction. There was something almost freeing in being told plainly that a skill was lacking and then being shown how to improve it, rather than being quietly judged behind polite smiles the way court life had always operated. Over the following days, she practiced the tasks she was given, gathering firewood, helping prepare meals for the communal hall, learning simple mending stitches from an older woman named Dora who ran the settlement's clothing stores, and slowly, awkwardly, she began to feel less like an intruder and more like someone with a place, however small, within the daily life of the pack. Not everyone welcomed her so readily. Felix, the young man who had questioned her loyalty in the council chamber, remained openly skeptical whenever their paths crossed, and Alara often caught him watching her with narrowed eyes as she went about her tasks, as if waiting for her to reveal some hidden deceit. She did not try to force his trust. Instead, she simply continued showing up each day, doing the work asked of her without complaint, answering honestly whenever anyone asked about her life at the palace or her reasons for leaving it. It was Cade's own behavior that puzzled her most in those early days. He did not seek her out often, occupied as he was with the daily responsibilities of leading the pack, matters of territory disputes, hunting arrangements, training schedules for younger pack members preparing to take on greater responsibilities. But she began to notice, in small moments, that his attention found her more often than seemed purely coincidental. He would appear near the training grounds when she was practicing basic self-defense with Miriam, watching from a distance without comment before moving on to other business. He would ask, briefly and without fanfare, whether she had settled into her new tasks well enough, whether anyone had treated her poorly, and though his questions were always brief and practical, there was something in the careful attention behind them that Alara found herself thinking about long after their conversations ended. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Alara found herself walking along the edge of the settlement as the sun set behind the western trees, casting long orange light across the clearing. She had grown to enjoy these quiet moments after the day's work concluded, a small pocket of peace before the communal evening meal, and she was surprised when Cade fell into step beside her, apparently returning from some inspection of the settlement's outer boundary. "You have settled in faster than I expected," Cade said, his tone conversational in a way she had not heard from him before. "I did not have much choice," Alara said, though there was no bitterness in the words. "It was learn quickly or remain useless, and I did not want to be useless." Cade glanced at her, something almost amused flickering across his expression. Most nobles who find themselves stripped of their usual comforts and complain endlessly about the change. "You have not complained once." "There did not seem much point," Alara said. "I chose to come here. Complaining about the consequences of my own choice would be a poor use of anyone's patience, including my own." They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the settlement's evening sounds rising around them, distant laughter from the training grounds, the clatter of pots being prepared for the communal meal, and Alara found she did not feel the need to fill the silence with careful words the way she had always felt compelled to at court. There was something in Cade's presence that did not demand performance, that seemed content simply to exist alongside her without expectation. "May I ask you something?" Alara said eventually, "that perhaps I have no right to ask?" Cade glanced at her, curious. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer. Why did the crown never manage to bring your pack under its authority, when it has controlled nearly every other territory in the kingdom? I have heard whispers about it my whole life, but never a true explanation." Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening tree line ahead of them. "My father refused to sign a treaty that would have required pack members to serve in the crown's armies whenever called upon, regardless of our own territory's needs. Aldrich's father called it rebellion. My father called it survival. There was conflict, brief but costly, and in the end, the crown withdrew, rather than risk further losses in unfamiliar terrain against fighters who knew every inch of these woods better than any soldier they could send against us. Since then, there has been an uneasy peace, neither side fully trusting the other, both sides waiting for some excuse to shift the balance permanently in their favor. And I have become that excuse, Ilara said quietly, understanding settling over her. Perhaps, Cade said. Or perhaps you have simply become the moment where a long simmering tension finally comes to a head, regardless of what either of us intended when you rode into these woods. He paused, then added, in a tone quieter than his usual measured cadence, I do not regret offering you shelter, Ilara Voss, whatever comes of it. Something in the way he said her full name, without the cold formality he had used their first night, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, and she found herself glancing at him more openly than she had allowed herself to before. In the fading light, his features seemed softer than they had in the firelit hall on her first night, less like the imposing alpha the entire kingdom whispered about with caution, and more simply like a man who had made a difficult decision and was choosing, deliberately, not to regret it. Thank you, she said softly, for that. They continued their walk in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with something neither of them named aloud, and when they finally returned to the settlement's central clearing for the evening meal, Ilara found herself unusually aware of the small distance between her shoulder and Cade's as they walked side by side, a distance that felt, for reasons she could not fully explain, smaller than it had been that morning. The weeks that followed deepened this quiet, unspoken rhythm between them, brief conversations after the day's work, small moments of shared silence that Ilara found herself looking forward to more than she was willing to admit even to herself. She learned more about pack customs, about the deep respect for loyalty and honesty that governed every interaction within the settlement, so different from the careful, calculated politeness of court life. She learned to hunt small game with a bow under Miriam's patient instruction, learned the names of the elder pack members who governed alongside Cade in matters requiring collective wisdom, learned the particular quiet strength it took to lead a people who valued honesty above flattery, action above empty promise. And slowly, without either of them acknowledging it directly, she found herself watching Cade not merely as the alpha who had offered her shelter out of political convenience, but as a man whose steady presence had become, in a remarkably short time, something she genuinely valued for its own sake. It was during this period of quiet adjustment that the first true sign of trouble arrived from beyond the settlement's borders, carried by a breathless young scout who rode into the clearing late one afternoon, his horse lathered with sweat, his face grim with news that would soon shatter the fragile peace Ilara had begun, cautiously, to believe might last. Alpha, the scout said, dismounting quickly and approaching Cade with obvious urgency. Word has reached the border checkpoints. The Crown knows the Lady Voss is here. King Aldrich has sent formal envoys, demanding her immediate return. The clearing seemed to go still around them, the easy rhythm of settlement life pausing as those nearby turned to listen, and Ilara felt the warmth of the past weeks give way, suddenly and completely, to the cold reality she had known was coming from the very moment she chose to ride north. Cade's expression hardened, the softness she had glimpsed during their evening walks, replaced entirely by the calculating stillness of a leader preparing for conflict. Bring the envoys to the outer settlement, he said. I will hear their demands myself. But make it clear, before they arrive, that this territory does not surrender what it has chosen to protect. He glanced once at Ilara, something unreadable passing across his features, before turning to begin issuing further instructions to the pack members gathering around him. Ilara stood rooted to the spot, watching the peaceful settlement she had grown to feel almost safe within transform, in a matter of moments, into something braced for confrontation, and she understood, with a clarity that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that the true test of her choice had only just begun. The royal envoys arrived 2 days later, a small but formal procession bearing the crest of Valoran, 3 mounted officials flanked by a modest guard escort, who clearly understood they were entering territory where numbers would offer little advantage if tensions turned to violence. Ilara watched their arrival from the edge of the outer settlement, standing beside Miriam, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and something close to defiance. The lead envoy, a narrow-faced man named Corwin whom Ilara vaguely recognized from court functions, dismounted with careful formality and addressed Cade with the practiced diplomatic tone of someone accustomed to speaking on behalf of a king who rarely tolerated failure. Alpha Ashgrove, Corwin said. His Majesty King Aldrich sends his regards. and his formal request for the immediate return of Lady Alara Voss to the palace, where her presence is required for matters of state. Lady Voss is not a possession to be requested and returned, Cade said evenly, standing with his arms loosely crossed, radiating a calm that Alara suspected was deliberately calculated to unsettle the envoy more than any show of aggression could. She came to this territory of her own free will, and she remains here by the same choice. If His Majesty wishes to discuss her presence, he is welcome to address her directly. I will not speak for her. Corwin's composed expression flickered, clearly not having anticipated being redirected so plainly, and his gaze shifted to Alara, standing a short distance away. Lady Voss, he said, adjusting his tone to something more overtly persuasive. The king is concerned for your well-being. Your sudden departure has caused considerable distress at court. He wishes only for your safe return, and assures full forgiveness for any misunderstanding that led to your leaving. Alara stepped forward, aware of every eye in the clearing now fixed on her, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that her voice did not waver at all when she spoke. There was no misunderstanding, Corwin. I overheard the king himself, in his own private council, explain to his advisers that he intended to set me aside for my sister, quietly, without informing me at all. I left because I refused to be discarded without a word, and then summoned back the moment my absence becomes inconvenient for him. You may tell him that I am not returning. A murmur passed through the small gathering, and Corwin's carefully neutral expression cracked slightly, revealing genuine discomfort at having his diplomatic script derailed so directly. Lady Voss, I must urge you to reconsider. Your continued presence here creates significant tension between the crown and this territory. It would be far simpler, for everyone involved, if you would simply return. Simpler for the king, perhaps, Alara said. Not for me. Corwin's gaze shifted back to Cade, his tone hardening slightly, as the diplomatic pleasantries began to wear thin. Alpha Ashgrove, I must be plain. His Majesty views your continued shelter of Lady Voss as a direct provocation. He requests, formally and finally, her return within the fortnight. Failure to comply will be viewed as an act of open defiance against the crown, with all the consequences such defiance historically carries. This territory has weathered the crown's consequences before, Cade said, his voice remaining level despite the clear threat embedded in Corwin's words. We survived them once, and we are prepared to do so again, if it comes to that, but I would remind His Majesty through you, that provoking conflict over a woman he himself chose to discard would not paint him favorably to the wider kingdom, should word of his private council conversation ever spread beyond these woods. The threat, delivered with the same calm precision Cade brought to every exchange, clearly landed with weight, and Corwin's expression tightened further before he offered a stiff, formal bow. I will convey your response to His Majesty. I hope, for the sake of all involved, that further conflict may still be avoided. The envoys departed shortly after, and as their small procession disappeared back into the forest, Alara felt the tension in her shoulders finally begin to ease, though a new kind of dread had settled in its place, the understanding that whatever fragile peace had existed between crown and pack was now genuinely, dangerously strained, and she was the cause of it. I am sorry, she said quietly to Cade, once the clearing had returned to something resembling its usual rhythm. I did not intend to bring this kind of conflict to your doorstep. You did not bring it, Cade said, turning to face her directly. Aldrich brought it, the moment he decided a woman's worth could be quietly reassigned without her consent, and the moment he decided this territory's sovereignty was something he could threaten whenever it suited him. You are not responsible for his choices, Alara, only for your own, and your own choice was simply to seek shelter from injustice. That is not something requiring apology. Alara studied his face, searching for any sign that his reassurance was merely diplomatic performance, and found instead the same steady honesty she had come to associate with him over the past weeks. Thank you, she said softly, for not making me carry guilt that was never mine to carry. Cade's expression softened slightly, something almost gentle passing behind his golden eyes. You have carried enough that was never yours to carry. From what you have told me of your life at court, I do not intend to add to that burden. The following days brought a palpable shift throughout the settlement, a quiet but unmistakable preparation for the possibility of conflict. Training grounds saw increased activity. Weapons were inspected and sharpened, Outer patrols doubled their usual routes along the territory's borders. Ilara found herself drawn into these preparations as well, no longer content to simply observe from the sidelines while others bore the weight of a danger she had, however unintentionally, brought upon them. She spent hours with Miriam refining her skill with a bow, hours with Dora learning to prepare provisions that could sustain a group through extended conflict if it came to that, hours simply listening to the elder pack members discuss strategy in the council chamber, absorbing everything she could about the territory she now called home, however temporarily, and the people who had chosen to stand behind her despite the risk. It was during one such council meeting, nearly a week after the envoy's departure, that a new complication arrived, one that would prove far more difficult for Ilara to navigate than any formal royal threat had been. A single rider approached the settlement's outer boundary, under a diplomatic banner distinct from the crown's official colors, requesting passage not on behalf of the king, but on behalf of House Voss itself. When the scouts brought word of who the rider was, Ilara felt her stomach drop with a dread entirely different from the tension of facing royal envoys. It was her sister. Seraphine had come to the border, alone but for a small personal escort, asking to see her. Ilara stood at the edge of the outer settlement, watching her sister dismount from her horse with the same practiced grace she had always carried. Golden hair braided neatly despite the long journey, her traveling clothes far finer than anything Ilara had worn since arriving in pack territory. For a long moment, the two sisters simply looked at each other across the small clearing, neither speaking, the weight of everything unsaid stretching thin between them. "You look different," Seraphine finally said, breaking the silence, her voice carrying a note of genuine surprise as she took in Ilara's simple wool dress, her sun-browned skin, the small calluses beginning to form on her hands from weeks of unfamiliar work. "I almost did not recognize you. A great deal has changed," Ilara said carefully, unwilling yet to fall into old, easy patterns of affection, until she understood exactly why her sister had come. Cade stood a short distance away, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough to allow the sisters' privacy, and Ilara was grateful for his quiet presence, even as she focused her attention on Seraphine. "Why are you here?" Ilara asked, more bluntly than she might have spoken to her sister only weeks before. Seraphine's composed expression flickered, something like hurt passing briefly across her features before she steadied herself. "I came because I was worried about you, Ilara. Truly worried, not on anyone's orders. Though I will admit, the king did ask me to speak with you, to try to convince you to return quietly, before this conflict between the crown and this territory grows into something none of us can undo." "Of course he did," Ilara said, unable to keep a thread of bitterness from her voice. "He would not risk his own dignity coming here himself. Easier to send you, to use the one relationship he assumes I would never refuse." "That is unfair," Seraphine said, her own voice sharpening slightly. "I did not ask to be part of whatever happened between you and Aldrich. I did not know, Ilara, I swear to you I did not know he intended to set you aside, until the announcement was already being quietly prepared. When I learned of it, I confronted him myself, and he told me the decision was already made, that there was no changing it." Ilara studied her sister's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception, and found only the same open, earnest expression Seraphine had always carried, the expression that had made her so effortlessly liked by everyone at court, including, apparently, the king who had chosen her over Ilara without a second thought. "I believe you did not scheme for this," Ilara said finally. "I never believed that, not even in the moment I overheard him speaking. But that does not change what happened, Seraphine. It does not change that he decided to discard me, as though I were something broken, without even the courtesy of telling me himself." "I know," Seraphine said quietly, and for the first time since her arrival, her composed exterior cracked fully, tears gathering in her eyes. "I know it was cruel, and I told him so myself, more than once. But Ilara, please, consider what continuing to stay here means. The crown will not simply let this rest. There could be conflict, real conflict, and people could be hurt, all because of a decision that was never truly yours to begin with. Would it not be simpler to return, to let the engagement quietly end on different terms, terms that do not risk lives?" Ilara felt the familiar pull of old patterns, the instinct to smooth things over, to make herself smaller and more agreeable for the comfort of others, and she recognized, with sudden clarity, that this instinct was exactly what had kept her silent and compliant for years at court, exactly what had made it so easy for Aldrich to plan her replacement without ever fearing she would object. "No," Ilara said, and the word came out steadier than she expected. "I will not return simply to make this easier for the crown. Seraphine, I did not choose this conflict. Aldrich chose it, the moment he decided my worth could be reassigned, in a private room, without my knowledge. If there is danger now, the responsibility for that danger lies with him, not with me for refusing to quietly accept how he treated me." Seraphine wiped at her eyes, studying her sister with an expression that mixed sorrow with something like grudging admiration. "You have changed," she said again, softer this time. "I do not think the sister I grew up with would have spoken so plainly, even to me." "Perhaps that sister needed to change," Ilara said. "Perhaps she spent too many years making herself smaller, so that everyone around her could remain comfortable." The two sisters stood in silence for a long moment after that, the weight of years of shared history settling between them, complicated by love that remained genuine, even amid the fracture caused by circumstances neither of them had fully chosen. Finally, Seraphine stepped forward and embraced her sister, and Ilara, after a brief hesitation, returned the embrace fully, allowing herself, for just a moment, to simply be sisters again, rather than pieces in a larger political conflict. "I do not want war between the crown and this territory," Seraphine said quietly, still holding on to her sister. "But I understand now that I cannot ask you to prevent it by sacrificing yourself again. I am sorry, Ilara. For all of it, even the parts that were never truly my doing." "I know," Ilara said. "And I do not blame you, Seraphine. I never did, not truly. I only wish you had known sooner, so that neither of us had to learn the truth in such a painful way." Seraphine pulled back, studying her sister's face one final time, before glancing briefly toward Cade, who had remained a respectful distance away throughout the entire exchange. "He seems different from how the court describes him," she said quietly. "Less like a monster, and more like someone who simply refuses to bow to things he does not believe in." "He is," Ilara said, and something in her own voice, some warmth she had not consciously intended to reveal, made Seraphine's eyebrows lift slightly with quiet understanding. "Be careful, Ilara," Seraphine said, though her tone carried no judgment, only genuine sisterly concern. "Whatever this becomes, be careful, for your own sake." "I will," Ilara said, and she meant it, though she was beginning to understand that whatever careful meant now, it no longer meant retreating from danger, simply to preserve someone else's comfort. Seraphine departed shortly after, her small escort disappearing back into the trees as she carried Ilara's answer, however unwelcome, back toward the palace and the king who had sent her. Ilara watched her sister go with a complicated mixture of grief and relief, understanding that whatever bond remained between them would need time and distance to heal fully, if it ever could. Cade approached once Seraphine had disappeared from sight, studying Ilara's face with quiet concern. "Are you well?" he asked simply, without the careful diplomatic distance he had maintained throughout the exchange. "I do not know," Ilara admitted honestly. "It was harder than I expected, seeing her again, but I do not regret what I said. I meant every word." "I could tell," Cade said, something like quiet pride coloring his voice. "You did not waver once, even when she offered you an easier path." "The easier path was never truly easier," Ilara said. "It only looked that way because I had spent so long convincing myself that making myself smaller was the same thing as keeping the peace." Cade studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his golden eyes that Ilara could not fully name but felt resonate somewhere deep in her own chest. "You are not small here, Ilara Voss," he said quietly. "Whatever comes next, I want you to understand that clearly. You have never once needed to make yourself smaller within these borders." The words settled over her like warmth spreading slowly through cold hands, and for a moment, standing in the quiet clearing with the forest stretching endlessly around them, Ilara allowed herself to simply feel the truth of his statement, without questioning it, without deflecting it with careful modesty, the way she had been trained to do her entire life. "Thank you," she said softly, and the two words carried far more weight than their simplicity suggested, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had shifted between them since that first tense night in the firelit hall, weeks that felt now like an entirely different lifetime from the one she had left behind at the palace. In the weeks following Seraphine's visit, the settlement's preparations for potential conflict continued in earnest. But alongside the growing tension, something quieter and far more personal continued to develop between Alara and Cade. Something neither of them named directly, but which both seemed increasingly unwilling to ignore. It began with small things. Cade started seeking her out deliberately, rather than allowing their conversations to happen only by coincidence, finding reasons to walk with her after the evening meal, asking her opinion on matters of settlement strategy that, weeks earlier, he would never have thought to include an outsider in discussing. Alara found herself looking forward to these moments with an intensity that both thrilled and unsettled her, aware that whatever was growing between them carried its own kind of danger, separate from the political conflict brewing beyond the settlement's borders. One evening, as autumn began to color the forest in deep golds and reds, Cade asked Alara to accompany him on an inspection of the territory's eastern boundary, a task he usually completed with senior pack members, rather than a noblewoman, still learning the basics of pack life. She agreed without hesitation, and they rode together through the changing forest, the easy silence between them, occasionally broken by quiet conversation about the land, about the history of the pack, about small details of Alara's childhood that she found herself sharing more freely than she ever had with anyone at court. "You speak of your mother often," Cade observed at one point, as they paused their horses near a quiet stream to let the animals drink, "but rarely of your father." Alara considered the observation for a moment, before answering honestly. "My mother saw me clearly, I think, in a way my father never quite managed. He was kind, but distracted, always focused on the political weight of our family name, rather than the daughter carrying it. My mother taught me to sit with my own thoughts, to trust my own judgment, even when the world around us seemed determined to convince me that judgment did not matter as much as obedience. She sounds as though she would have approved of the choice you made. Riding north," Cade said quietly. "I like to think so," Alara admitted, a soft ache accompanying the words, the familiar grief of losing her mother years earlier, resurfacing gently, rather than sharply, softened by time, and by the strange, unexpected comfort of sharing the memory with someone who listened without judgment. They continued their ride in comfortable silence after that, and as the sun began to set behind the western hills, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and deep purples, Cade guided them to a small rise overlooking the territory, a place, he explained, where pack members had gathered for generations to watch the sunset before returning to the settlement for the evening meal. "I wanted you to see this," Cade said, as they dismounted and stood together at the edge of the rise, the vast forest stretching endlessly below them, bathed in the fading golden light. "I wanted you to understand what it is we are protecting, beyond simply defiance of the crown." Alara studied the view before her, the sheer scale of the territory, ancient and wild and undeniably beautiful, and she felt something settle within her chest, a recognition that whatever came next in the growing conflict with the crown, this land, this people, this quiet, deliberate way of living, had become something she genuinely cared about protecting, not merely as a political symbol, but as something worth defending for its own sake. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "It is," Cade agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found his gaze fixed not on the landscape before them, but on her, something warm and unguarded in his golden eyes that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Cade," she said quietly, uncertain exactly what she intended to say, only aware that the moment felt weighted with something neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. "I did not expect this," Cade said, his voice quieter and more uncertain than she had ever heard it, a startling vulnerability, replacing his usual measured composure. "When you arrived, I saw only a strategic opportunity, a way to finally force the crown to acknowledge what this territory has always deserved. I did not expect to find myself caring for the woman herself, beyond whatever political advantage her presence offered." Alara's heart pounded against her ribs, the honesty in his words settling over her, with a weight that felt both terrifying and wonderful.
"I did not expect it either," she admitted. "I came here running from a life where I was never truly chosen, never truly seen for who I was beyond my usefulness to someone else's plans."
"I did not expect to find, in the middle of fleeing that life, someone who saw me clearly enough to care about the difference." Cade turned to face her fully then, his expression open in a way she had rarely witnessed, the careful composure of the Alpha giving way, in this quiet moment, to something far more personal. "I care for you, Alara Voss," he said simply, without the careful diplomatic distance he usually maintained. "Not for what your presence means politically, not for the leverage it offers against the crown, but for you, entirely and separately from any of that. I wanted you to know that clearly, whatever comes next." Alara felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, not from sorrow but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of finally being seen and chosen, not out of convenience or strategy, but simply for who she truly was. "I care for you as well," she said softly, "more than I expected to, more than I think I fully understood until this very moment." The space between them seemed to shrink, though neither of them moved deliberately closer, and for a long, suspended moment, they simply stood together on the quiet rise, watching the last light of the sunset fade slowly into the deepening blue of evening, the weight of everything unspoken between them finally, gently, acknowledged. "Whatever comes with the crown," Cade said finally, breaking the charged silence, "whatever conflict lies ahead, I want you to know that my care for you is not contingent upon how useful your presence remains to this pack's political position. I would protect you regardless, even if the crown suddenly lost all interest in your whereabouts tomorrow." "I believe you," Alara said, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she meant it completely, without the careful skepticism that had governed her every interaction at court for so many years. They rode back to the settlement as full darkness settled over the forest, the easy silence between them now carrying a warmth that had not existed before that evening's conversation, and as they approached the torch-lit clearing of the central settlement, Alara felt, for the first time since overhearing that devastating conversation in the palace so many weeks before, something that felt remarkably close to genuine happiness, undiminished by the danger still gathering beyond the territory's borders. That happiness, however, would prove short-lived. Barely a week later, a rider arrived at the settlement's edge, bearing grim news that would shatter the fragile peace of those quiet weeks entirely, carrying word that King Aldrich, humiliated by his envoy's failed mission and pressed by his own advisors' growing concerns about appearing weak before the wider kingdom, had issued a final, formal ultimatum, one that left no room for further negotiation or delay. The scroll bearing the king's seal was delivered by a single rider under a white banner, left at the boundary marker without ceremony, and brought to Cade in the council chamber, where the pack's senior members had gathered upon hearing the news. Alara stood near the back of the room, her heart pounding as Cade broke the seal and read the contents aloud, his voice steady despite the gravity of the words. "King Aldrich Thorn of Valoran hereby declares that Lady Alara Voss shall be returned to the crown's custody within 7 days of this notice," Cade read, his jaw tightening slightly with each word. "Failure to comply will be regarded as an act of open rebellion against the crown, and the crown reserves the right to respond with whatever force is deemed necessary to reclaim what belongs to it, and to restore order to territories that have too long presumed themselves beyond the reach of royal law." A heavy silence settled over the chamber as the full weight of the ultimatum sank in. 7 days. Alara felt the room seem to tilt slightly around her, the reality of what her presence had brought upon this pack finally crystallizing into something undeniable and immediate. "He means to force the conflict he has wanted for years," Gareth said grimly, his weathered face set in hard lines. "This was never truly about Lady Voss alone, Alpha. It is about finally bringing this territory to heel, using her as the excuse he needed." "I know," Cade said, setting the scroll down on the long council table with deliberate control, "but knowing his true motive changes little about the choice before us. We have 7 days to prepare, or 7 days to decide upon a different path entirely." Felix, who had remained skeptical of Alara throughout her time in the settlement, spoke up then, his voice carrying less hostility than it once had, tempered by weeks of watching her work honestly, alongside the pack without complaint. "Alpha, I do not say this lightly, given how wrong I may have been about her intentions. But we must consider what war with the crown would truly cost. Our numbers are strong, our knowledge of this land unmatched, but Valoran commands resources we cannot easily match if this becomes a prolonged conflict rather than a single confrontation." "I am aware of the cost, Felix," Cade said. "I have always been aware of it. It is why my father chose treaty over war whenever possible, and why I have tried to do the same, until Aldrich left us, with an ultimatum that offers no room for treaty at all. Alara stepped forward then, her voice steadier than she expected, given the storm of emotion rising within her. "I will not let this pack go to war over me," she said, drawing every eye in the chamber toward her. "I did not come here to bring destruction upon people who showed me kindness and shelter when I had nowhere else to turn. If returning myself to the crown prevents bloodshed, then that is what I will do." "No," Cade said immediately, his voice sharp with a force she had rarely heard from him. "I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself simply to spare us a conflict that Aldrich himself chose to provoke. That is not a solution, Alara. That is surrender disguised as nobility, and it changes nothing about the deeper conflict between this territory and the crown. He will simply find another excuse, another moment to press for the control he has always wanted, if we teach him that threats against you succeed." "Then what would you have me do?" Alara asked, frustration and fear mingling in her voice. "Stand by, while people I have come to care for risk everything because of a decision that was never truly mine to make? I would have you trust that this is a choice we make together, not one you bear alone," Cade said, his voice softening slightly, even as its underlying resolve remained unshaken. "You did not ask for this conflict, Alara, but neither did this pack, asked to spend generations resisting a crown, determined to erase our independence. This moment was always coming, in one form or another. Your presence here simply hastened its arrival." The chamber fell silent again, the weight of the decision before them settling heavily over everyone present. It was Miriam who finally spoke, her voice thoughtful rather than combative. "Perhaps there is a third path, beyond simple surrender or simple war. Perhaps we do not need to hand Alara back to a king who has no true claim over her, nor rush blindly into conflict he has deliberately provoked. Perhaps, instead, we make the true nature of his demand impossible for him to hide behind." Cade turned to her, curious. "Explain." "The king frames this as a matter of reclaiming his betrothed," Miriam said. "But Alara herself has already told us, and told his own envoys, that the betrothal was already effectively broken, by his own private words, before she ever left the palace. If Alara were to formally and publicly renounce the betrothal herself, before witnesses from both territories, there would be nothing left for him to reclaim. He could not credibly demand the return of a woman who has no remaining obligation to him at all, without revealing to the entire kingdom exactly why she left in the first place, and exactly what he said in that private council room." A slow understanding began to dawn across the chamber, and Alara felt something shift within her own chest, a possibility she had not fully considered taking clear shape for the first time. "You mean to strip him of his justification entirely," she said. "Not fight him directly, but remove the very foundation his ultimatum stands upon." "Precisely," Miriam said. "He cannot wage open war over a private betrothal that no longer legally exists, not without revealing his own cruelty to the wider kingdom, cruelty that would cost him far more support among his own nobility than any territorial dispute with us ever could." Cade studied Alara carefully, something like cautious hope entering his expression, for the first time since the ultimatum had arrived. "It is a bold path," he said, "and not without risk. Aldrich may still choose conflict regardless of how thoroughly his justification is stripped away, simply out of wounded pride." "Perhaps," Alara said, feeling a new resolve settling over her, steadier and clearer than the fear that had gripped her only moments before. "But if he does, then the entire kingdom will see exactly what kind of king is willing to go to war over pride alone, once his true motives are laid bare. I would rather face that risk honestly than hide quietly behind a return that changes nothing about the deeper injustice at the heart of all this." Cade held her gaze for a long moment, something passing silently between them, understanding and resolve, and something deeper still, that neither of them needed to name aloud in this moment of gathering crisis. "Then we prepare for both possibilities," he said finally, turning back to address the full council. "We prepare formally to strip Aldrich's ultimatum of its foundation, publicly and undeniably. And we prepare, simultaneously, should he choose conflict regardless, to meet that conflict with everything this territory has ever stood for." The council chamber erupted into focused, purposeful activity after that, plans being drawn, messages prepared to be sent to allied territories and trusted contacts near the palace, who might help ensure the truth of Alara's departure reached the wider kingdom's ears before Aldrich could control the narrative entirely. Alara found herself swept into the preparations alongside everyone else, no longer simply an outsider sheltered within these borders, but an active participant in a plan that could, if it succeeded, change the very balance of power between crown and pack for generations to come. As the chamber slowly emptied late into the night, the practical details of the coming days settled into place. Cade remained behind with Alara, the two of them standing together amid the maps and scattered notes of the evening's planning. "Are you certain of this path?" Cade asked quietly, all the earlier urgency of the council session giving way to something more personal, more searching. "I am certain that I will not be used as an excuse for either side's ambitions any longer," Alara said. "Not the crown's, and not this pack's either, however much I have come to care for this place and its people. If we do this, we do it because it is right, and because it finally gives me the chance to choose my own future openly, rather than hiding from a decision someone else made in my absence." Cade reached out then, gently, and took her hand in his, a small gesture, but one that carried enormous weight, given everything unspoken that had grown between them over the preceding weeks. "Whatever the days ahead bring," he said quietly, "know that you do not face them alone, Alara Voss. Not the ultimatum, not the crown's anger, and not whatever choice about your own future finally comes of all this." Alara squeezed his hand in return, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his presence, and together they stood in the quiet council chamber, the weight of the coming confrontation settling over them both, but tempered now by a resolve neither of them had possessed alone, and a bond that had grown, unexpectedly and completely, into something worth protecting in its own right, regardless of whatever the crown chose to do next. The next 7 days passed with an intensity unlike anything Alara had experienced since arriving in the Northern Territory. Messages were dispatched quietly to allied houses and trusted contacts throughout the kingdom, carrying careful, factual accounts of the private conversation Alara had overheard in the palace, along with word of the formal renunciation ceremony being planned at the border between Crown lands and Pack territory, a ceremony that would take place in full view of witnesses from both sides, leaving no room for the king to later dispute or reframe the events. Cade worked tirelessly throughout those days, coordinating with pack elders on contingency plans should Aldrich choose conflict, despite the loss of his official justification, while also personally overseeing the diplomatic outreach, meant to ensure the truth reached the kingdom's wider nobility, before the king could suppress it. Alara found herself at the center of both efforts, drafting careful, honest accounts of her departure, to be shared with sympathetic nobles, while also training daily with Miriam, determined that whatever came on the appointed day, she would not stand helpless and unprepared. On the 5th day, word arrived that House Voss itself, upon learning the full truth of what had transpired in the king's private council, had quietly begun withdrawing its unconditional support for the crown's planned military response, unwilling to see their own daughter, caught in the middle of a conflict born from the king's own cruelty. Alara's father, though he did not travel north himself, sent a brief, formal letter acknowledging her choice and expressing, in careful but unmistakable terms, that he would not stand against her decision to renounce the betrothal publicly, whatever cost that decision carried for the family's standing at court. It was not the warm reconciliation Alara might once have hoped for, but it was, she understood, as close to acknowledgement as her father was capable of offering, and she found herself grateful for even that much support amid the gathering storm. On the appointed day, the border clearing between Crown territory and the Emberfang lands filled with a tense assembly unlike anything the region had witnessed in a generation. Royal representatives stood on one side, formal and rigid in their ceremonial dress, while pack members and allied witnesses from neighboring territories gathered on the other, the invisible line between the two groups, charged with decades of unresolved tension, now brought fully into the open. King Aldrich himself arrived, having apparently decided that avoiding the confrontation entirely would appear weaker than facing it directly. Dismounting from his horse with the same practiced regal bearing, Alara remembered from countless court functions, though she noted, with quiet satisfaction, a tightness around his eyes that betrayed genuine unease beneath the composed exterior. "Alara," Aldrich said, his voice carrying across the clearing with careful, measured warmth, clearly intended for the watching witnesses, rather than for her alone. "I am relieved to see you well." Whatever misunderstanding led to your departure, I hope we may resolve it here, today, and return to the arrangement that has long served both our families." Alara stepped forward, flanked by Cade on one side and Miriam on the other, feeling the weight of every gathered witness's attention settle upon her, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she felt no fear at all, only a steady, unwavering clarity. "There was no misunderstanding, Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing. "I heard you, in your own private council, tell your advisors that you intended to set me aside for my sister, quietly, without ever informing me directly. I heard you describe me as unremarkable, as someone no one would miss, someone who could be replaced without consequence. That was not a misunderstanding. That was the truth of how you valued me, spoken plainly when you believed no one who mattered was listening." A murmur rippled through the gathered witnesses, and Alara watched Aldrich's composed expression falter slightly, his gaze darting briefly toward his own advisors, several of whom shifted uncomfortably at the public airing of what had clearly been meant to remain private. "I do not deny that conversation occurred," Aldrich said finally, apparently recognizing that outright denial would only further damage his standing before so many witnesses. "But surely, Alara, private council discussions are not meant to determine final policy. Nothing had yet been decided. You told your advisors the announcement would come quietly, after the summer gathering," Alara said, refusing to let him soften the truth before the assembled witnesses. "You had already decided. You simply had not yet informed the one person whose entire future you were deciding, without her knowledge or consent." Aldrich's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something like genuine anger flickered across his features before he mastered it, forcing his expression back into careful neutrality. "Regardless of past conversations," he said, "you remain formally betrothed to the crown, Alara, and that betrothal carries obligations that cannot simply be abandoned because you overheard an unfinished discussion and chose to flee rather than address it directly with me. Then let us address it directly, now, before every witness gathered here," Alara said, and she reached into the satchel at her side, withdrawing a formal scroll she and Cade had carefully prepared over the preceding days, its seal bearing both her own family crest, and, beside it, a formal notation from House Voss, acknowledging her right to act independently in this matter. "I, Alara Voss, formally and publicly renounce the betrothal between myself and King Aldrich Thorn, effective immediately, on the grounds that the crown itself has already demonstrated its intent to dissolve the arrangement without my knowledge or consent. I claim no ill will toward House Thorn in making this renunciation, only the right to determine my own future, a right that was nearly taken from me entirely." She held the scroll aloft for the assembled witnesses to see clearly, and Miriam stepped forward to formally record the renunciation before the gathered representatives from both Crown and Pack territories, ensuring the moment could never later be disputed or quietly erased from record. Aldrich stood rigid, clearly recognizing that any further objection would only compound the damage already done to his standing before the wider kingdom's witnesses. "You understand," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier performative warmth, "that this renunciation ends any formal claim this crown has upon your return." "That is precisely the point, Your Majesty," Alara said. "There is nothing left for you to reclaim. I am no longer your betrothed, and I never truly wish to be reclaimed as though I were property in the first place." For a long, tense moment, the clearing held its breath, every witness watching to see how the king would respond to having his ultimatum so thoroughly and publicly dismantled. Finally, Aldrich's shoulders dropped slightly, the last of his rigid composure giving way to something closer to grim acceptance. "Very well," he said. "The betrothal is dissolved by your own formal renunciation, witnessed and recorded. I will not pursue further claim upon your person, Lady Voss." He paused, his gaze flickering briefly toward Cade, something unreadable passing behind his eyes before he continued. "Though I suspect your reasons for remaining in this territory extend beyond mere refuge from an unwanted marriage." Alara did not flinch from the implication, nor did she feel any need to deny it. "My reasons are my own, Your Majesty, as they have always been, whether you chose to consider them or not." Aldrich held her gaze a moment longer before finally turning away, gesturing for his advisors and guards to prepare for departure, the formal confrontation concluding without the violence so many gathered witnesses had feared might erupt. As the royal procession began to withdraw from the clearing, Cade stepped forward to stand beside Alara, his presence steady and warm at her side, and she felt, for the first time since that devastating night overhearing Aldrich's careless dismissal, the full weight of freedom finally settling over her, complete and unburdened by any remaining obligation to a crown that had never truly valued her at all. In the days following the confrontation at the border, word of what had transpired spread quickly through the kingdom, carried by witnesses from both territories who had seen firsthand the truth of Ilara's renunciation and the private cruelty that had prompted it. Nobles throughout Valoran who had once viewed the Emberfang territory with suspicion found themselves instead quietly reconsidering their assumptions, some even sending careful, informal messages of respect toward a woman who had chosen her own dignity over quiet compliance with a king's careless dismissal. King Aldrich, for his part, retreated into a period of careful public silence regarding the matter, allowing the story to settle without further royal comment, understanding, Ilara suspected, that any additional attempt to control the narrative would only draw further unwelcome attention to his own conduct. The formal renunciation stood, recorded and witnessed, and with it, any lingering claim the crown held over Ilara's future dissolved entirely. Seraphine sent a letter shortly after, warm and honest, expressing quiet pride in her sister's courage, and acknowledging, without bitterness, that whatever future Ilara chose, now belonged entirely to her. Ilara read the letter seated on the same quiet rise overlooking the territory where Cade had first spoken openly of his feelings for her, and she found herself smiling as she folded the parchment carefully away, grateful that some threads of her old life had survived the upheaval intact, transformed but not severed. The settlement itself settled slowly back into its familiar rhythms. In the weeks that followed, the tension of preparing for potential conflict giving way gradually to a quieter, steadier peace. Ilara continued the work she had begun during her earliest days in the territory, no longer clumsy or uncertain, but genuinely skilled now in the practical tasks that sustained pack life, respected by those around her, not for her noble birth or her connection to the crown, but for the honest effort she had consistently shown since the very first day she arrived. Even Felix, whose skepticism had lingered longest among the pack members, found himself approaching Ilara one afternoon as she helped repair a section of fencing near the training grounds, his expression carrying none of its former wariness. "I was wrong about you," he said simply, without elaborate apology, in the same plain, direct manner Ilara had come to appreciate as characteristic of pack life. "You have earned your place here, whatever your birth once suggested about where you belonged." "Thank you, Felix," Ilara said, genuinely touched by the acknowledgement. "That means more to me than you likely realize." It was on a clear evening, several weeks after the confrontation, as autumn deepened fully into the territory's characteristic golden and crimson hues, that Cade found Ilara again, on the quiet rise overlooking the vast forest, the same place where they had first spoken openly of their growing feelings for one another. "I have been thinking," Cade said, settling beside her as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, "about what comes next, now that the immediate danger has passed." "As have I," Ilara admitted, "though I confess I am no longer certain what next even means, for someone who has spent her entire life having her future decided by others." "Then perhaps," Cade said carefully, "it is time you decided it fully for yourself, without anyone else's expectations shaping the choice." He turned to face her directly, his golden eyes carrying the same open vulnerability she had glimpsed once before on this very spot. "I do not wish to pressure you into any decision, Ilara, especially not so soon after finally claiming the freedom to choose your own path. But I want you to know plainly that my feelings for you have not changed, and if anything, they have only deepened through everything we have faced together these past weeks." Ilara felt her heart swell with warmth, the same steady certainty that had carried her through the confrontation at the border now settling over this far gentler, more personal moment. "My feelings have not changed either," she said softly. "If anything, watching you stand beside me through all of this, watching this entire pack choose to risk everything for a stranger who arrived uninvited into your territory, has only deepened what I feel." "Then stay," Cade said simply, reaching for her hand with the same gentle certainty he had shown in the council chamber weeks before. "Not because the crown forces you into hiding, Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose this place, and choose me, freely and completely, exactly as you chose to ride north on that very first night. Elara looked out at the vast, golden forest stretching before them, at the territory that had become, in the span of a few short months, more genuinely home than the palace ever had in her entire life, and she felt the full weight of the choice settle over her, clear and unburdened by any lingering doubt. "I choose this," she said, turning to meet Cade's gaze fully. "I choose you, Cade Ashgrove, not out of desperation, not out of strategy, but because for the first time in my life, I have found someone who sees me completely and values me exactly as I am, without needing me to be smaller, or quieter, or easier to replace." Cade's expression broke into something rare, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his usually composed features entirely, and he reached up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture carrying more tenderness than any of the careful court rituals Elara had spent her whole life learning. "Then let the entire kingdom understand plainly," he said, "that Elara Voss was never simply cast aside and left with nowhere to turn. She chose her own path, deliberately and completely, and found in it a place, and a love, worth every risk it took to claim." As the sun finally dipped below the western hills, casting the last warm light across the ancient forest that had become her true home, Elara leaned into Cade's steady embrace, feeling, at long last, the complete and unshakable certainty of being chosen first, not out of convenience, not out of political necessity, but simply and entirely for who she truly was. The kingdom of Valoran would speak of that autumn for years to come, of the noblewoman who refused to be quietly discarded, of the king who learned too late the cost of careless cruelty spoken behind closed doors, and of the alpha the crown had always feared most, who had offered not just shelter to a woman in need, but a place where she finally, completely, belonged. And in the heart of the ancient northern forest, far beyond the reach of any throne, Elara Voss stood exactly where she had chosen to stand, free, valued, and entirely, unshakably her own.